Okay, this week we're going to take a look at momentum, and this is a way of describing how objects interact with each other when they exert forces on one another. So if I've got two objects, so let's say we've got a ball here and a ball here, and this object's moving over here with a given velocity in some direction, and it has some mass. It's going to come over and impact this other ball. And when it does that, it's going to exert a force on that ball. And because of Newton's third law, there's going to be an equal and opposite force, which means that this ball is going to exert a force on this ball that's equal and opposite to the force that this ball exerts on this ball. And that force is going to interact over a given amount of time. And how that force interacts with that object is going to determine how they move after they collide. So this is a way of describing the interactions of these objects and being able to predict what's going to happen when objects interact. We have a name for this property, and it's called impulse. So the impulse is when I exert a force on an object over a certain amount of time. That's what we define as the impulse. And that force can be complicated. If you imagine, if this ball, let's say instead of hitting another ball, it's hitting a wall, right? If this ball is compressible or something like this, you could have some really crazy looking force. Some bizarre looking force that compresses the ball as it interacts with the wall. And we don't necessarily need to know what the details of this interaction are. All we need to do is figure out the average force interacting over that period of time, provided that the average force is giving us the same area under the curve as whatever complicated force is going on. As long as we can measure how long the interaction takes, we can kind of get at this average force for what's happening in the interaction. And if we have an object that's hitting a wall, so here's my ball coming in, flies in like this, hits the wall and bounces back, that is, that whole interaction is described by the impulse. And if we look at the units of this impulse, that's going to be, force times time. But a force is a mass times an acceleration times this time. And if you look at the units of this, that has units of kilograms, meters per second. So as we learned before, a times delta t is the velocity of the object. So it's the change in velocity over that time. And then this is the mass, which implies that you should be able to measure this impulse by measuring the change in the mass times the change in velocity. And this right here we're going to call the change in momentum. And so this tells us that if we can measure how the velocity of the object is changing, we can measure the impulse. And this is where this concept of momentum comes from. And it turns out that momentum, like energy, is a conserved quantity, and we can use this to solve a bunch of physics problems.